Earl Whitmore was 78 years old when he got a phone call he never expected. On the other end of the line was an admiral from the United States Navy, asking him to return to the USS Missouri, a steel giant that had once made history, the same battleship where he had served decades earlier, now silent and motionless in a shipyard. The ship was about to be dismantled and sold for scrap, but one last attempt to save it had failed. Engineers, modern equipment, digital systems, nothing worked. The main engine remained jammed, completely unresponsive. Earl wasn't an expert in high technology, and there were no fancy diplomas hanging on his walls, but he knew that ship better than anyone. While the young engineers watched him with skepticism, some joking that he looked like he'd been brought straight from the museum, the USS Missouri refused to die, and the admiral knew the key to saving it lay somewhere in the past of that old veteran. The call came on an ordinary Tuesday morning. Earl was in the backyard of his home in Norfolk, Virginia, fixing the fence that had given way the week before. He wasn't expecting visitors. He wasn't expecting news. At 78, his life was simple. Breakfast at 6, a walk to the park, small repairs around the house, dinner alone. When the phone rang, he hesitated before answering. Unknown numbers rarely brought good news. The voice on the other end was formal, direct. Admiral Richard Hayes, United States Navy. Earl took a few seconds to process it. He hadn't spoken to anyone from the Navy in years, not since he retired decades ago, quietly, with no ceremony or memorable farewell. Hayes didn't waste time. The USS Missouri, now docked at a shipyard on the East Coast, was being prepared for one final purpose before dismantling. The Navy had decided to turn it into a technical training vessel, a floating lab for naval engineering students. But during the final tests, the main engine seized. Completely. No system responded. No manual explained why. For 3 weeks, teams of specialists tried to reactivate the propulsion system, digital simulations, computer diagnostics, full reviews of every electronic circuit. Nothing. The Missouri remained still, a massive, lifeless hulk of steel. The scrapping contract had already been signed. The deadline was closing in. Then someone remembered Earl Whitmore, the last living man who had served aboard the Missouri during its final missions. The only person who truly knew that engine. Earl didn't answer right away. He stood in silence looking at his yard, at the tools scattered on the ground. After all these years, being called back felt unreal, almost ridiculous. "Why me?" he finally asked. "Because no one else knows what to do," Hayes replied without hesitation. 2 days later, Earl arrived at the shipyard. The place was enormous, surrounded by cranes, containers, and metal frameworks. The Missouri sat docked at the far end, imposing even in silence. Earl stopped for a moment when he saw it. It wasn't nostalgia, it was recognition, like meeting something you'd never really forgotten. He was greeted by Captain Leonard Briggs, a man in his 40s, straight posture, calculating eyes. Briggs led the technical restoration project. He trusted digital systems, simulations, data, and had little patience for anything that couldn't be found in a current manual. "Mr. Whitmore," Briggs said, extending his hand. His tone was polite but distant. Earl shook his hand but never took his eyes off the ship. Briggs exchanged a look with Martin Cole, the chief engineer, a younger man with glasses and a tablet always in hand. Cole looked even more skeptical. To him, Earl was a desperate bet, a museum piece. "With all due respect, Mr. Whitmore," Cole began, "we've already conducted full analyses. Fuel systems, valves, ignition circuits, temperature sensors, everything's been checked." Earl looked at him without expression. "Then you checked it wrong." The silence that followed was brief, but uncomfortable. Briggs took a deep breath and motioned for someone to escort Earl. Lieutenant Paul Grayson, a 30-something technical assistant, was assigned to accompany him during the inspection. Grayson was polite, but it was clear he doubted that this white-haired veteran could solve what entire teams had failed to fix. They descended into the engine room. The space was vast, filled with pipes, valves, and gears that hadn't moved in years. The smell of old oil and cold metal filled the air. Earl walked slowly, observing every detail. He didn't touch anything yet. He just looked. Grayson explained what had been done. Electronic systems reviewed, sensors replaced, ignition tests performed, fuel flow simulations run. Everything indicated the engine should work, but it didn't. Earl stopped in front of the manual valve panel. He knelt down with effort, one hand on the cold floor. He ran his fingers along the pipes, feeling the seams, the old welds, the worn spots. "You started the engine before cleaning the oil lines?" he asked without looking up. They were visually inspected. No sign of blockage. Earl shook his head, standing up slowly. Visual inspection's useless when the problem's on the inside. Grayson frowned but said nothing. Earl kept walking, checking the fuel tanks, intake valves, and the old filters that had been ignored because they didn't appear in the digital schematics. He knew what to look for. He knew every corner of that system. He'd spent years keeping that engine alive under conditions no manual ever described. He knew where oil tended to pool, where degraded fuel hid, where invisible failures began to grow. After nearly an hour, Earl stopped in front of a specific section of the propulsion line. He pointed to a manual valve, almost hidden between larger pipes. "Here," he said, "the problem's right here." Grayson looked at where Earl was pointing. The valve looked ordinary. Nothing unusual about it. Just another part among hundreds of others. "That valve's been tested," Grayson said, checking his tablet. "No anomalies detected." Earl didn't argue. He simply crouched down again and began loosening the connection with his bare hands. Grayson started to step in, but hesitated. There was something about the confidence in Earl's movements that made him stop. When the valve finally came loose, Earl tilted the pipe, and a thick, dark liquid began to drip out. It wasn't clean oil. It was a heavy, almost solid sludge, degraded fuel that had built up over the years inside the tanks. The smell was sharp, acidic. Grayson's eyes widened. That didn't show up in any of the diagnostics. "That's because you didn't know where to look," Earl replied, wiping his hands with an old rag he'd brought in his pocket. "That fuel's been sitting here for decades. It breaks down, turns to paste, clogs everything. And when you tried to start the engine without clearing it out first, you locked up the whole system." Grayson said nothing. He looked at the dark liquid on the floor, then back at Earl. For the first time, doubt gave way to something else. Respect, maybe. Or simply the realization that they had completely underestimated the man standing in front of them. Earl spent the next several hours working. He dismantled entire sections of the fuel line, manually cleaned every pipe, every valve, every filter. He didn't use any modern equipment, just basic tools, the same ones he'd used decades earlier. Grayson followed him silently, watching every move. When Cole and Briggs came down to check the progress, they found Earl covered in grease, his hands blackened, his face lined with exhaustion. Cole looked around at the scattered parts and the dark fluid still draining through the grates. "What's going on here?" he asked, his tone disapproving. "I'm fixing what you broke," Earl answered without looking up. Cole opened his mouth to respond, but Briggs stopped him with a gesture. The captain watched Earl for a long moment. There was something there he hadn't expected. It wasn't stubbornness. It was quiet competence. The kind of knowledge that doesn't come from manuals or simulations, but from years of real experience. "How much time do you need?" Briggs finally asked. "Until tomorrow morning," Earl replied. "If no one gets in my way." Briggs nodded and left, taking Cole with him. Grayson stayed. Night settled over the shipyard. Most of the crew had gone home. The place was quiet now, filled only with the distant hum of machines in other sections. Earl kept working. Grayson brought coffee in paper cups. They didn't talk much, they didn't need to. At one point, Grayson asked, "How long did you serve on the Missouri?" Earl paused, wiping a valve with his rag. 6 years, the last missions. Then she was decommissioned. And I got forgotten right along with her. Grayson didn't know what to say. He stayed silent, watching Earl get back to work. Around 3 in the morning, Earl finished. He reinstalled the last valve, checked the connections, closed the panels. He stood up slowly, feeling the weight of age in his back and knees. But the job was done. "All set," he said simply. Grayson looked at the system. It looked the same as before, but he knew it wasn't. The next morning, The full team gathered in the control room. Hayes had arrived during the night to oversee everything. Pressure was coming from all sides: media, politicians, veterans who couldn't bear to see the Missouri dismantled. This was the last chance. Briggs stood by the main console. Cole, tense, checked the systems for the 10th time. Grayson was near Earl, who stood apart, leaning quietly against the wall with his arms crossed. Hayes gave the order. "Start the engine." Cole initiated the ignition sequence. For a moment, nothing happened, only the low hum of auxiliary systems. Then came a sound, deep, rising. The turbines began to spin, slowly at first, then faster, stronger. The main engine came alive. The sound rolled through the engine room, through the walls of the ship, across the entire shipyard. The Missouri was alive again. Cole's jaw dropped. Briggs let out the breath he'd been holding. Hayes closed his eyes for a moment, relief washing over his face. Grayson turned to Earl, who showed no emotion, just gave a small nod, as if confirming something he'd always known. The engine kept running, steady, powerful. For the first time in decades, the heart of the Missouri was beating again. Hayes crossed the room and stopped in front of Earl. He extended his hand. "Thank you, Mr. Whitmore." Earl shook his hand but didn't smile, just did what had to be done. Briggs stepped forward, visibly humbled. "I underestimated you, sir. That was a mistake. I'm sorry." Earl looked at him, then at Cole, who couldn't meet his gaze. "Don't worry about it," Earl said calmly. "Time's taught me there are more important things worth holding on to." The news spread quickly. The USS Missouri, just days away from being dismantled, had been saved. The engine that no expert could bring back to life was running again, and all thanks to a 78-year-old veteran the Navy had almost forgotten to call. Over the next few days, reporters showed up at the shipyard. Cameras, interviews, endless questions about how Earl had done what modern engineers couldn't. He avoided most of it. He didn't like the spotlight. He didn't think he'd done anything extraordinary. But inside the team, something had changed. Cole, who once looked at Earl with skepticism, now came to him for advice on old systems that weren't covered in the manuals. Grayson began joining him on other inspections, learning not only what to do but how to think about problems that computers couldn't predict. Briggs called a meeting with the entire technical crew. Earl was invited to attend. When he walked into the room, everyone stood up. It wasn't an order, it was instinct. A quiet gesture of respect. Briggs spoke briefly about the project's future. The Missouri would now move into its final phase, becoming a training vessel. Young engineers would learn there, inside that historic battleship, how to handle real systems and real problems. Earl would be welcome to return whenever needed, as a consultant. But Earl knew it was more formality than invitation. He didn't belong to that world anymore, not really. He'd done what needed to be done. Now it was time to go home. Before leaving, Earl walked alone across the Missouri's deck. The afternoon sun glinted off the gray steel. A cold breeze came from the sea. He stopped by the rail, looking out toward the horizon. He placed his hand on the metal, feeling its rough surface, the marks of time. On that ship, he had been young. He'd served alongside men who never made it back. He'd seen battles, losses, victories that were never celebrated. And when it was all over, he'd been discharged without ceremony, without recognition, just another veteran among thousands. But there, in that moment, he wasn't forgotten. The Missouri remembered, and so did he. He looked once more at the ship, its towers, its hatches, its silent guns. Everything was still there, preserved. But it was the past, and Earl no longer lived in it. That night, before leaving the shipyard, Earl went down to the engine room one last time. It was empty. The engine still hummed, steady and strong. He stopped in front of the valve panel he had repaired. He ran his hand along the pipes, feeling the warmth of the metal. He didn't say a word. He just stood there for a moment before turning and walking away. The next morning, Earl was back home in Norfolk. The yard looked just as he'd left it. The fence still needed fixing. His routine waited for him, unchanged. But something was different. He knew it. It wasn't pride, it wasn't satisfaction. It was the quiet certainty that, even forgotten, he still had worth. he could still make a difference. A few weeks later, Earl received an envelope in the mail. Inside was an official letter from the Navy, a formal note of gratitude signed by Admiral Hayes. Along with it came a photograph of the Missouri, its engine running, and a small plaque engraved with Earl's name. Earl read the letter once. He placed the photo on the living room table. The plaque he put away in a drawer, not because it didn't matter, but because it didn't need to be on display to have meaning. He knew what he'd done, and that was enough. That afternoon, Earl went back to the yard. He picked up his hammer, nails, and new wood, and began working on the fence again. His hands steady, his movements precise. Life went on, simple, quiet, but full of purpose. And somewhere, miles away, the USS Missouri lived on, training new generations, teaching that the true measure of a person isn't in titles or recognition, but in what they can do when no one else believes it's possible. Earl didn't have to be there to know that. He already knew. He always had. Months passed. Autumn arrived in Norfolk. Earl kept his routine, morning walks, small repairs around the house, brief chats with neighbors. Life carried on quietly. But something in him had changed. It wasn't visible. It wasn't something you could point to or name. It was a different kind of calm, the certainty that his time hadn't been wasted, that even through decades of silence, he still carried something the world needed. One day, Grayson showed up at his door. No notice, just a knock, a pause, and when Earl opened, the young lieutenant stood there in uniform, holding a folder. "Mr. Whitmore," he greeted. "Sorry to drop by unannounced." Earl motioned him in and offered coffee. They sat at the kitchen table, the same one where Earl had eaten every meal alone for years. Grayson explained that the training program aboard the Missouri was exceeding all expectations. Young engineers were learning not just theory, but real hands-on practice. And many had heard Earl's story. They wanted to meet him, to learn from him. "They need someone to teach the new technicians," Grayson said. "Someone who lived it, someone who knows the mistakes, the shortcuts, the fixes only experience can teach." Earl listened quietly, then looked out the window at the yard where he spent most of his days. "I'm old, Grayson. Not sure I've still got that in me. You saved a ship they were about to scrap, just because you remembered what everyone else forgot," Grayson replied firmly. "That's exactly what they need to learn." Earl didn't answer right away. He wasn't thinking about the invitation, but about what it meant. To be remembered, to be called back, to have purpose again. Days later, Earl returned to the shipyard, not as a formal consultant, but as a teacher. Few times each month he went aboard the Missouri and spent hours with the young engineers. He showed them the systems, explained the failures, told stories from his service days, about the challenges he'd faced and the improvised fixes that had saved lives. The young men listened closely, asked questions, took notes, and for the first time in decades, Earl felt he belonged to something larger than his quiet routine. But he didn't fool himself. He knew the day would come when this too would end. When he'd grow older, others would take his place, and his story, like so many others, would fade again into memory. And that was all right, because Earl had learned something few people ever do. The value of a life isn't in being remembered forever. It's in making a difference when it matters, in showing up when you're needed, in knowing that, even in silence, you've left something that endures. One afternoon, after a training session, Earl stayed alone on the Missouri's deck. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the steel. He rested his hand on the railing once more, feeling the cold metal beneath his fingers. "We're both still here," he murmured quietly to himself. And it was true. The ship that had nearly been lost, the man who had nearly been forgotten, both still had something to give. Not because they were perfect, but because they had endured. Because they knew the weight of time, and because, when called upon, they answered. Earl left the shipyard that day with a peace he hadn't felt in years. He went home, made dinner, sat at his table, and for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel alone. Because he knew. He knew that his worth wasn't in the medals he'd never received, nor in the speeches no one ever gave about him, but in the depth of experience and the wisdom forged by time. And even if the world forgets, There always comes a moment when the value of someone forgotten is revealed. Earl Whitmore's worth proved itself once again. The moment he kept the metallic heart of the USS Missouri from stopping forever. If you enjoyed this story, click the like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next.